Last year, after I finished giving my talk in this wonderful festival, a lovely Scottish woman came to me and said, "Tall, dark, handsome, you must be Scottish." Unfortunately, I'm not. I'm a man from the Caribbean. Please don't tell David Starkey. He might blame me for the next riots. But I wrote a book titled What If Latin America Ruled the World? And I was invited by Mark and Catherine to chair this absolutely wonderful panel on the Arab Spring and the power of democracy. And I was wondering at first, why a Latin American to chair a panel on the Arab Spring? Until I started to realize that when we talk about the power of democracy, we talk, as Iseldin Abouleish told us earlier this afternoon, about finding hope in the most hopeless of situations. That's the power of democracy. And whomever implies that democracy will inevitably be defeated by might is leaving us with no hope. And that is not just a historical falsehood, it is an ethical error. I'm surrounded by giants, and what I mean by that is not just the fact that the four people on this table are brilliant at what they do. They are absolutely gigantic at being the best example of humanity you can find anywhere. You have met Iseldin Abouleish. Let me introduce you to Mary Colvin, a war correspondent, magnificent journalist, an inspiration to many of us in this business. Sir Kieran Prendergast, former UN diplomat, British diplomat, and a man who knows the region better than pretty much anybody else I know of, and Rashid Rahman, the editor of Pakistan's Daily Times. We're here to talk about the power of democracy. We're here to talk about hope. We're here to talk about what's next, about the present and the future. And if you have the chance to read the life story of the four people on this table, you will understand why they have so much to say about it. So let me start with a very simple question. Do you believe that democracy is powerful? That it is powerful in general, and powerful enough in particular in the case of the different conflicts which are going on in the Arab world? Iseldin.
When we come to democracy, which democracy? Is it the political democracy that we are talking, or political freedom? Just the voting and electing and selecting our leaders? I think in our life we have priorities. And the priority for every one of us is the freedom. Freedom that we want to live free, freedom of speech, freedom of need, freedom of being homeless, of sick, of poverty. At that moment, the power of democracy, which needs, it's a process. It's not one time a dress that I want to change it, go to dress my dress. Democracy is a longer process, and it needs to prepare the ground to accept that democracy. Give the people the life they deserve, the freedom they want, and at the end, even I can say to you, democracy is part of the freedom.
But Mary, wouldn't some people, those who call themselves realists, those whom I call cynics, wouldn't they say that this is just a romantic view of democracy, that underground what we see is dictators and people with plenty of military power actually dashing the hopes of democracy?
I'm going to just, take your word democracy and throw it into the audience. Throw it out.
I am with you to throw it
Throw
away.
it out. It means nothing.
Leave it behind.
Democracy is meaningless. What you need, and I think you will agree with me, you need rule of law. A political system only works when you have rule of law. And what that means is that we go right back to the Magna Carta. It doesn't actually matter how far we go back. It is a human need. You don't need a tribe if you have rule of law. If you have a king is answerable to the same law as a peasant, as the man who is just lost his 3 children, his girls. I was with this at the end of the border. I'm so proud of him. I'm shocked that somebody could be so forgiving and not angry. But that is not about democracy, it is about justice. And the only way to have democracy is to have justice, rule of law. I go to court, and that judge says to me, these are the rules. You are guilty or you are not guilty. Out of that springs a political system, be it democracy, be it whatever you want. Democracy's fuzzy. I just came from Libya. People are saying, we are so privileged. No, they're not saying we are so privileged. I am saying we're so privileged. We are so privileged. I'm sitting with my taxi driver, who is he's got, a master's degree and a doctorate. He's driving me. He's so much more educated than I am. And he's saying to me, could you just tell me what is left and what is right? Gaddafi has stopped them from learning English. They're not part of the world community. What would be great is not, what's left, what's right. So we then say, and they repeat to you, Libyans, freedom is not free. We have to work for it. Every rebel in Libya, and I went through Cairo and watched Mubarak in a cage, they don't know what freedom is, but they're willing to know, and they're willing to fight for it, and they care about it so much that it makes me reimagine and understand how great freedom and democracy is, and how much we take advantage of being free. But I go back to it is rule of law.
Mary makes me realize that perhaps we have taken law, democracy, institution building for granted, what we have here. We have forgotten about how important it is. We have forgotten about the fact that we have to struggle for it, that it cannot be given. Freedom cannot be given. If that is the case, then is it a mistake when the West says we're going to go into, say, Libya and try and help? Are they pursuing their own interests? How do we try to clarify, make some sense out of this, difficult dichotomy that Mary was talking about? What's right, what's wrong?
I think I agree with you that sitting where we are here today, the historical memory of how democracy came into being in the West is probably lost in the mists of time. It was not smooth, it was not easy, it required struggle, bloodshed, wars, civil wars. That much of history I know about Europe and even the United States, where Mari comes from. So to think to think that in the Arab world, Latin America, or Asia, Pakistan, where I come from, that is going to somehow happen easily, without bloodshed and without struggle, I think is the greatest illusion of all. As to your question, can it be imposed from the outside? I must respectfully disagree. The whole history of democracy suggests to me that unless it's an internal movement and a struggle by the people themselves, no outside power, no matter how well-intentioned, can possibly bring about a genuine democracy unless and until the people themselves want it, struggle for it, sacrifice for it. Dictators, as Murray was saying a minute ago, of course want a hermetically sealed system whereby information, knowledge, all these things are denied so that dissent, critical thinking, and the ability to challenge the given order is not available to its people. Despite their efforts, it re-emerges in shoots, in little saplings, and then greater trees which grow irrespective of dictators' wishes. In Pakistan, of all places, we know this so well. 65 years after Pakistan came into existence, we are, despite the fact that there's an elected government in my country as we speak, we are still fighting for democracy. And I agree with the assertion, it's not just elections or an assembly. It's a whole gamut of freedoms that are required, and the freedom of expression most of all. We have made advances in Pakistan. The media has never been as free in Pakistan as it is today. I come from it, so I can talk about it. But that too, by and in itself, is no guarantee that you will advance towards the objectives or targets or vision that you have set yourself. It still requires struggle because we have politicians who, despite being elected and despite spouting the principles of democracy morning, noon, and night, in practice do not necessarily extend to the people the kind of delivery and the kind of rights, shall we say, that democracy implies. So what I'm suggesting is democracy is in and by itself not a panacea for all the issues that confront humanity. It provides the space, it provides the terrain on which those struggles have to be pursued. Hopefully, if it is a good democracy or a genuine democracy, that makes the task easier. But if it is something that is compromised by vested interest and by people in power who are visionless, incompetent, and arguably corrupt, then we have a very big task on our hands. And in Pakistan's case in particular, and I can quote Egypt and I can quote other examples, the military is the dominant fact of life. And despite having an elected government, the military still dominates. As far as foreign policy and security policy is concerned, Afghanistan is concerned, certainly. And in many other aspects too. So the residual is left to the elected government, and that's not very much, frankly. So what I'm arguing is, democracy as a goal is something to be fought for and something to be desired. But in and of itself, it is only a beginning, and it provides the terrain on which you move forward or not move forward, as the case may be.
If it is the case, as Rashid says, that people have to stand up for themselves and gain their own freedom, what can the international community do to help? Does it help, or actually it is getting in the way?
Well, I think one of the problems is that the international community tends to want to see things in a way which is familiar to it. I mean, that's why this session is called something about democracy. Actually, I think for most of the populations concerned, democracy is not the top item on their agenda. I think they were extremely worried about aging, sclerotic, dictatorial leadership. They were worried about corruption. They were worried about the failure to provide employment and goods. Most of all, maybe they were worried, or the trigger was they were worried about lack of dignity, lack of respect. They were fed up with being treated as subjects and not treated as citizens, and they wanted these things to change. But let's not forget that there has not been a single instance so far in this so-called Arab Spring of regime change. Not a single one. I mean, there has been leadership change. So Mubarak has fallen. Mubarak is now a spectacle or has been a spectacle on television, but the essentials of the regime, as Rashid mentioned, remain. I mean, the country is still fundamentally run by a military council. President Saleh has left in Yemen, but the regime is still there. The president and his hyper-rich family have left in Tunisia, but the regime is still, I mean, they've got a new cabinet, but essentially the regime is still there. I think the other thing we need to understand is to be careful what you wish for. One of my formative experiences was being private secretary to David Owen when he was foreign secretary. And in the last year I was there, we had big problems in Iran. And the left wing of the Labour Party was arguing that nothing could be worse than the Shah. And David Owen was saying rather bravely, actually, in the face of parliamentary opinion, that yes, things could be a lot worse than the Shah. I mean, the Shah was far from perfect. I'm not arguing in defence of him, but look what happened. And I would say that we ought to recognise in the West that we're still in the foothills of change. We've got no idea, in many cases, what we're dealing with. In Libya, what are we dealing with? Who are we dealing with? Are we dealing with Islamists? Are we dealing with tribalists? Or whatever? And so one thing we can do is recognise, as Rashid said, that change will come from within. Another thing we can do is avoid attaching neat, easy, CNN-type labels very early on in the game, and stop thinking that this is a game of cowboys and Indians, or white knights and black knights. That one side are goodies, the other side are baddies, because usually it's a lot more complicated than that.
What does the Arab Spring mean for Palestine?
The Arab Spring, when you speak spring, the word spring is a green. Spring is a beauty, something flourishing. And spring comes after winter, and the people enjoy it in a sudden. But I don't think it's a mistake to use the word spring. The people there, something happened, a change. It looks for me like a pregnancy happened, but we don't know what will happen with the pregnancy. And the most important to wait till we have a healthy delivery and to see the baby living and the breathing and the mother. Still, it's too early to judge. And I can say to you, it's important to speak about it. The people there in Egypt, in other countries, they are looking to have freedom and the choices, the freedom of a choice. They are deprived of that freedom of a choice. When our brother Rashid said about the military, those dictatorships who have been there for 40, 30 years, are they dictatorships just today to realize, and we discovered them just today? They have been there for 40 years, but who created them and who made them? Who supported this military machine they have to use it in a brutal way against their people there? From where the money comes? It's important to admit and to diagnose it. It's someone in this world who is supporting them, and they became invalid for them today, expired. I can say to you, if in December, Hosni Mubarak, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and Gaddafi is willing to come to visit the States, UK, France, the red carpet will be spread for them, and they will respect them. I think it's time to say the word and the change in time. We need the courage, the moral courage to say it to them. There are wars years ago, and I think this spring there are a few good things from it. The first thing, it gives hope. Who made it? The young men and women who once we thought of them, they are spoiled with internet, with nightclubs, and a sudden they stood up like a lion to reject this oppression and tyranny and to say it's our time to take the lead. The second, it proved that military approaches and those military men and dictatorship are useless. The weakest, you see it, the weakest is the one who is carrying the gun. And the guy, the man or the woman who are naked, and he can't press the button to kill and to shoot them. The third, it was the spark for the change in this world. It started in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, and then went to Europe. And that's a lesson, I can say. It's a lesson for all leaders to wake up people's patience has limitation. And they can keep patient at the end. If they explode, they will explode and destroy, and to say the right word. And that's what I think. I am hopeful about it, and it will happen one day, and to spread, to make the change in every country, and most leaders to adopt it as a lesson and to learn.
Are you as hopeful as Iseldin, Mary? Do you think that
I think
these
it's
will develop
incredibly hard to follow Iseldin. He's in this speaking because he just said everything that is encompassed in the Arab Spring, which is now going to the Arab. It's just brilliant, but it's very hard to follow him in terms of speaking. So I'm going to try. And I'm just so proud to be sitting next to you, really.
And me also, it's thanks to Mark, who gave me the opportunity to come. We met in a checkpoint, but you see this world,
We met
it's a
at
changing.
checkpoint,
It's
yeah.
hope. We are meeting here, and to speak about that and to make the difference in this world.
We met at a checkpoint with Iseldin's, the bodies of his girls.
So should we maintain hope even if things seem to be going awry, even if things seem to be going badly? Say
What
Libya,
Iseldin
Russia.
said is, and 2 points I'd like to follow up on, is extremely important. I mean, I've covered the Arab world, let's say it's a Muslim world. We were talking about this earlier. The language matters. So I would say Arab and Iran, and obviously I go to Afghanistan, but let's stay where we are because it's the Arab Spring, and it's very much the Arab Spring. Not to forget Tehran, and I was in Tehran when it erupted. It is the younger generation. They are brave. I had, to be really honest, I had gotten bored with the Middle East. Much as I love it, these sclerotic, awful, endless dictators who say they're your father, and they play on the whole Arab tradition. Your father, you can't go against your father. Mubarak is your father. Gaddafi is your father. He's not a leader. He's not a general. There's no army in Libya. He is your father. You know what? The younger generation just said, this is crap. Yeah. Aren't you
He is the
proud?
father of all. I don't imagine that father, how many wives? You have over those children.
Actually, Mary, you have touched upon a point that as a Latin American matters, a lot.
Yes, it's
There is something very particular about what has happened in Latin America. It is the region of the world where which has most women in power, not only at the top, but also at the bottom.
Yeah.
Something changed there. The usual image of Latin America is machismo and so on and so forth. And of course, that's truth. But at some point, it became clear, particularly to young people, that women had been politicized, while the men went to war and, joined either the left-wing guerrilla or the right-wing paramilitary and so on and so forth. Women stayed in their communities, not at home, in their communities. And they became the basis of something that is becoming more and more stable. Is that what is lacking in the case of the Arab Spring?
Now, I'm going to go back to starting in Latin American, because I'm obviously American.
By the way, if you're bored with the Middle East, please come to Latin America.
It's very, we are so used to, in a way, the military coup, the military coming in. And the other thing was saying the youth came in. Women were involved, but it's much more complicated in the Middle East. So in Tahrir Square, I was in Tahrir Square, there were women there and they were doing exactly what you said. They were the foundation. By the way, in Libya, I was 8 weeks in Misrata, for example. I didn't see a woman. So that's all. But what I wanted to go back to talking about, the connection, because it really reminded me of being American and the Latin American revolutions. What was so different, and what I think I'm not really sure I've gotten my head round. These are revolutions. Egypt, well, Tunis was barely. Ben Ali and his wife fled as soon as the kids came out, stopping only by the bank to pick up lots of gold, and then they went to Saudi. But what was very interesting is the maturity of the young people, because they didn't say, and like in Latin America, I'm sorry, and I'm going to sort of put history into sort of 4 minutes, but they didn't say, we're taking over, we're kids. They said, whoa, we kicked out Father, we kicked out these dictators. Remember, they're not just kicking out dictators, and I was there. We were getting shot. I wasn't. Well, I was shot in Sri Lanka, but not in DR. But I was tear gassed. Kids next to me died. They fought, and they were not army. But what they said was, "Wow, we've kicked these guys out, but we're not old enough or wise enough to run the country, so we're going to turn it over to the military." Now, that in South America, that was unbelievable, because like in Argentina and other places, they were killing the kids. But what's interesting, and I'd really like to see what people think about this, they said to the military, the military, remember, the army didn't shoot, the police shot. And that's key to why this happened. They turned it over to the military, in Egypt particularly, and said, could you run this till we have democratic elections? We want enfranchisement. We want to be able to say where our country is going, but we're not ready to do that yet. We're so mature. And now we are seeing tests of the military, which is really feeling a little bit scared by the kids, woken up by the kids. In Cairo, for example, and I will now cut this, but in Cairo, for example, Mubarak is only in court because the kids went back to Tahrir Square and said, you know what, we overthrew Mubarak, but he's living in a really nice villa that he got out of corrupt money, and his 2 sons, are you joking? They're billionaires? Why? They're not even smart. They're billionaires because they dealt with the army, and they sold off a bit of that coast, and they got that cut. They're going to court, or we're going to stay. We're going to go back to Tahrir Square, and we're going to stay here. So it's that balance, and the army is listening. So I guess my headline would be kids and the social networks and the younger generation said, we're not willing to wait, we want enfranchisement. And the army is playing a very different role than it did in South America. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, it is very interesting that the role of the army has changed. It is also, I also have to point out that what has allowed Latin America to recover much of its lost sovereignty in the last decade is the fact that the U.S. has been distracted. It's been elsewhere.
Very good point.
Does that ring a bell?
Absolutely. I'm a 60s child.
Well,
In the 60s, we knew about dictatorship in Latin America and elsewhere. And it has been very interesting to watch the trajectory that part of the world has followed and how the military has been rolled back. Those were dirty wars fought by the military in which people disappeared, were shot, executed, tortured, all sorts of things. And interestingly, I think it's the mothers and sisters and daughters who actually kept that issue alive in many countries in Latin America. And I think finally, somewhere, the penny dropped. It's been an incremental series of rollbacks of the military in Latin America. And that is why you have the democracies you have today there. And that is why you have the number of women in power upstairs and downstairs that you spoke of. But let me give you a few examples from history that we might learn something from. And I will come back to the Arab Spring, and I try to be as brief as possible. In Pakistan, we had an Arab Spring, or the equivalent, in 68-69. We had a dictator called Ayub Khan, who'd, put on the mantle of field marshal, put it on around his own neck. And for 7 months, and this was United Pakistan, when East Pakistan was not yet Bangladesh, for 7 months, the people of Pakistan were in the streets against him. Every day, millions of people. And at the end of the 7 months, the military reimposed martial law. And that movement then took a different turn. What am I saying? I'm saying that was a totally spontaneous eruption, like the one we had in Tunisia, and then we had Egypt and other places. A seemingly totally unrelated incident, very small and, inexplicably, it led to a generalized uprising, much like what is happening in the Arab Spring in many countries. But what was common to that movement in Pakistan in 68, 69, and I believe the movements in the Arab world, is by their very nature, spontaneous uprisings of this sort have limitations. What are those limitations? They can bring down a regime, but they are not organized politically to replace those regimes. And so what happens is, for example, in Tunisia, I think whatever establishment was behind the ex-ruler is still in power and handling the transition. The military in Egypt, let me remind this audience, has been in power since 1952, when the free officers coup overthrew the monarchy. So they were a very powerful force in the system. And in a sense, these rulers have been sacrificed and made scapegoats in order for the transition to be controlled by the very forces of the old regime, which want to make sure that this doesn't take a turn which cuts across their interests or destroys their interests. Now, therefore, I think the point was made in an oblique way by Marie that, the young were mature enough to say, okay, we're not ready for this. But I think it is not just maturity. It's a mature recognition of their own limitations and of the limitations of that spontaneous movement. Interestingly, if you look at the case of Egypt, you find the best organized force, which has been around for donkeys, is the Muslim Brotherhood. And they have played their cards very well. All the alarm in the West about the Muslim Brotherhood taking over and fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, now being the consequence of the Arab Spring in Egypt. What have they done? They've played their cards in such a way that they've said, no, we are not interested in taking over, we are not interested in power, we are interested in a democratic transition, and we will be part of that transition, and we will accept the democratic voice of the people. That diffused that entire alarm, if I may so put it. And today, in the transition that is taking place in Egypt, in my view, whenever an election is held, and it won't be long now, I suspect, it's the parties that have that experience, years of struggle underground and overground in all sorts of ways. Arguably, they will be best placed to take advantage of this transition. I hope that doesn't happen, but my fear is there. And I would say that, as I said earlier in my remarks, democracy in and by itself is not the panacea for every ill that afflicts these societies. It provides opportunity. It provides an opening. What happens and how that opening or opportunity is used is very much dependent on the concatenation of political forces in that society and how they are organized, well organized or not so well organized. The eruption, for example, of new parties in Egypt in anticipation of the transition and of the elections, these are new people to this field, and therefore one must wait and see whether they have the capacity to rise to the challenge, which is enormous, as I say, compared with a Muslim Brotherhood which has been struggling for 60 years. So, these transitions, I'm trying to say, that come as a result of spontaneous uprisings that in and by themselves are not able to replace the regime, they are only able to bring it down, and often the powers that be will find scapegoats, sacrifice them in order to retain their grip on the system. And now it remains to be seen, and this is, I think, the $64,000 question. Where will this transition lead? How will it play out? And will the hopes that we have of democracy in these areas after years, decades of dictatorship, how they will be achieved? I would argue complacency will be the enemy of the democratic forces. And a struggle is bound to ensue. No, it won't happen tomorrow. There will be a period of relative peace and political contention, rivalry, and perhaps assemblies and elected governments and so on. But whether that will resolve the problems, I think the jury's out.
It's almost time to get some questions from the audience, but before we do that, I wanted to ask one last question, Sir Kieran. I pointed out that the U.S. Army was kind of stretched, distracted. It was doing its usual business elsewhere, and that allowed Latin American grassroots movements to develop into parties, which are now in power. But it is also the case that the result has not been exactly, pleasing for the United States. Take the case of Venezuela. Something like that might happen as a result of the Arab Spring. Again, does this mean that we need to rethink what we mean when we say the international community, so that it's not just the 5 privileged ones trying to, keep hold of the reins over the military in these places, as it was the case in Latin America, and continue to defend their own interest, even to the detriment of the interest of the people over there?
Well, I certainly think that constant vigilance is going to be required. I mean, revolution is very often followed by counter-revolution. I think we have to be absolutely sure that that change is real, and that change is not just apparent. I used to live in Turkey, and I still deal with Turkey a bit. It took civilian governments almost 30 years to begin to write a civilian constitution after the last real coup, which was in 1980 or 1981. And then there was a constitution written the next year, which gave extraordinary privileges to the military. And I think there are some signs, for example, in Egypt, that the Egyptian military would really rather like to have a constitution along the lines of the 1982 Turkish constitution, which doesn't just put the military as the guardians of democracy and the guardians of the country, but also gives them very considerable economic privileges. And I think we have to watch against that very much, and avoid the old American temptation that he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, because sometimes he turns out just to be a son of a bitch, and that's not really what you're after. I think that Rashid was absolutely right. Military government doesn't work when it's too direct. In Pakistan, for example, I think it's both amusing and tragic to watch how every single military dictator who turns himself into a president has fallen one way or another.
And it's the people who've overthrown him. And, no dictator in Pakistan has had more than 10 years. So we have a better...
Sometimes it's a long time.
Sometimes it's a case of exploding
10 years
mangoes.
is a long time.
As in with President Zia, it was exploding mangoes on a plane when I think he embarrassed the military too much. But the trouble is that in your system, politicians haven't exactly been great either. So you have this awful alternation between how to avoid this in the Arab Spring. And I think I would say something rather unfashionable, which is that you need to go slow. You don't need to speed it up. You need to slow it down. And particularly when it comes to the writing of a constitution and also the holding of elections. Because for the reasons that Rashid mentioned, in a country like Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is by far the best organized party. It takes time to allow normal parties, political parties, to develop. And I think it's no coincidence that the Muslim Brotherhood are strongly opposed to slowing things down. They want a quick referendum, they want quick elections, because they will benefit greatly from that. I mean, my experience at the UN in observing these things was that the more time and trouble you took over drawing up a constitution, the more consultation there was, the more inclusive the process was, the more people felt that they had some sense of ownership of the new constitution, the better the result. I mean, look what happened in Iraq when they rushed it through. The Shia said we can't accept a very significant number of the basic articles of the constitution. And the West needs to show patience, because there is a temptation in the West to think this is a very, very good thing. We must go with the wave. We must drive through a new constitution. First of all, it shouldn't be we. It should be them. And secondly, we have to show strategic patience and persistence, and encourage a genuinely democratic society to observe. Because my last point is that you must never, ever forget, those of you who've been brought up and lived all your lives in a democratic society, how habit-forming dictatorship is. It's not just the dictators, it's also the population grows up traumatized and thinking along dictatorial lines. And you can change the system much faster than you can change the mindset. So I would say, yes, slow down and make sure that change is real.
Let me stop
point.
you there because we need to receive.
One point.
some
I
questions.
just wanted to
Very
say
quickly.
that there are calls in Pakistan today because of the disappointment in the democratic government for the military to intervene. So, habit forming as.
Well, and remember, please, that Sir Kiran just quoted Henry Kissinger's "my son of a bitch" theory, referring to the case of Chile. And as you know, the kids are in the streets in
there
Chile,
was
they're on the
Noriega.
streets, because it has taken at least 4 decades to get rid of that effect. It is still there. Iseldin, you're going to have to forgive me. Can we get some questions from the audience? There is one question here.
Hello, speaking this time. Are there any parallels between the Arab Spring and the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Who would like to go for that one?
I think no. I mean, I think the experience in not just the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rapid change in Eastern Europe, it's an entirely different phenomenon. And we need, every situation is unique. Every situation is different. I don't even like the term Arab Spring. I would say Arab Springs. Because in some of them there's a wish to have regime change, in others there's to have reform and to do away with the executive presidency or the executive king. And in some there are problems of religion between different sects of religion. In others there aren't. It's sui generis, and we have to treat it as it is, and not try and see it as a rerun of something from a completely different society.
Can I just say I absolutely agree with that, but there is a moment, there is a parallel in the sense of a dictator is a dictator. And do you remember that moment when Ceausescu was standing in the square and somebody booed him, and the look on his face when he was a dictator who was unquestionable, he was like, what is that? And that moment suddenly made everybody in the square, and obviously he was later killed, as was his wife, very quickly, but the look on his face when he was booed and catcalled, it wasn't a boo, it was a catcall, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That is a moment that I think, and I absolutely agree in terms of the different political stresses, et cetera, but it's a moment in the breaking of fear. And dictators are about fear. And what you have seen in the Arab world, and I have been stunned by it, I'd like to hear from our colleague here, is the breaking of fear. And it's like in Libya, in Cairo, it was just like, whoa, we can do this, we're still alive. And you know what, that guy, someone next to me was killed, he was sniped, and they went on. The breaking of fear, and that to me is the parallel.
I think there is parallel of that, and the positive thing of this Arab Spring, that someone from outside thinking of him, he is seeing it from a golden tower, and I am the angel, and the others are the bad who are suffering. And now where it is exported to Israel, the social movement in Israel, I think, who are appealing to smash and destroy those mental and physical barriers, the wall they built between Palestinians and Israelis. About 200 to 300,000 Israelis are demonstrating everywhere against the wall, against the current Israeli government, against the policies. This is the parallel of that. The second, I agree with you with the change. It's a change. Drastic, dramatic change, what is happening. And I am blessed to be a medical doctor. It looks for me like a transplant, cardiac, renal, liver transplant, and we must prepare the patient, the recipient for the transplant. I think the patient is not ready to accept this huge transplantation. And the most important in medicine is the post-op period. Sometimes the patient dies in the post-op, or to reject the transplanted organ. We must be cautious, and my hand is my heart, wishing them to succeed, to take it serious, and to slow it down.
Quick comment. I want to remind the audience of the first spring that we heard of. That was in 1968 in Prague. Now we know how that ended. The guarantor of communism in Eastern Europe intervened, Soviet Union, with tanks. In fact, the Warsaw Pact as a whole. So that died a premature death. Now, the Berlin Wall, communism, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, it's a whole different ball game. There are parallels, but I think it would be dangerous to read too much into the parallels. The Berlin Wall in '89 would not have fallen if the Soviet Union itself was not going through a phase of reform under Gorbachev, which probably militated against the kind of intervention in East Germany which happened in Czechoslovakia in '68, '69.
Can I just throw something else out here that's a difference in the Arab Spring? And it was positive at the beginning. And now I think it's problematic. There are no leaders. And it is most extraordinary to have revolutions across a region that was known for the dictatorship, authoritarian, oppressive regimes, all led by a often charismatic but essentially oppressive personality. All of these revolutions in the Arab Spring, we're not going into, there are no leaders. Now that meant that they were able to erupt and tweet and continue. And by the way, the Arab Spring is not just about kids. Everybody else joined. That the kids were the tipping point that brought everyone in. No leaders. No leaders. And that is now actually scary because it allowed the revolutions to succeed because all of the Arab world, they were looking for, all of the security services were looking for the leaders. They chopped them off. You know, they made sure their heads rolled. They were looking for those political people, educated, feisty. They're all gone. So when you have a leaderless revolution, these security services, they can't do anything. And literally throwing it out. But what do you do now when there are leaderless revolutions across the Arab world? People learning, people wanting freedom, people wanting enfranchisement, but no leaders. I think it's almost a new chapter in history. Exciting, but worrying.
I think Marie's point is the perfect point to end this discussion. We could stay here the rest of the afternoon. Please catch them outside while they are signing books and getting to talk to you, ask more questions. This is just the beginning of a debate that we must have, not just because it matters what is happening there, but I think it makes us think about what is happening here just as well. So please join me to thank these four wonderful, wonderful speakers this afternoon.